Good evening. I am Shadrach Philip, MSc student of Federal University Wukari, Nigeria. I'll be presenting on the topic starvation, metabolic response, survival, and death. What is starvation? Starvation is an extreme deficiency in caloric energy intake, an imbalance between energy or nutrient supply and body utilization. It is the most severe form of malnutrition. In humans, prolonged starvation can cause permanent organ damage and eventually death. This picture here, this figure is depicting people that are suffering from starvation or acute malnutrition. Objectives of the studies: to determine types of starvation, to determine various causes of starvation, to determine body responses to different stages of starvation, to determine how death occurs when there is no alternative energy source. Methodology. The information was acquired from peer-reviewed studies in variety of scholarly journals. A search of electronic databases such as Midline, ScienceDirect, PubMed, and Google Scholar was done. Starvation, famine, malnutrition, and hunger were among the keywords utilized in the search. Types of starvation. There are basically two types of starvation, which are acute starvation and chronic starvation. Acute starvation. This condition results from unexpected or sudden cessation of food and water. The cessation of food and water in this condition is complete, while in chronic starvation, this condition results from gradual deficiency in supply of food and water. And causes of starvation. There are various or numerous causes of starvation, which include the following: anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, clinical depression, coma, crash dieting, diabetes mellitus, untreated, digestive diseases, famine, fasting, malnutrition, overpopulation, and poverty. During starvation, the body is in an emergency situation. The body needs to survive. The body must adjust in order to survive. This process of adjustment is what is known as metabolic response. During metabolic response, the body switches on to various stages. Stage one, in stage one, there is increased glycogenolysis. Stage two, there is increased gluconeogenesis. Stage three, there is increased lipolysis and fatty acid beta oxidation. Stage four, there is increased ketogenesis. This picture here will be used to explain various stages. Okay, during these stages, when in a normal situation, when one ingests food, let's take for instance carbohydrate food, the body will convert this carbohydrate to glucose. When glucose is in excess in the body will release hormone glucagon. Insulin. This insulin will convert the excess glucose into glycogen. This glycogen is stored in case of emergency. But during starvation, like in this case, the body will release glucagon to break down glycogen. This glycogen will be broken down into glucose phosphate via the pathway, glycogenolysis pathway, to produce glucose. And this glucose is utilized by brain and other tissues. After this condition, then the next thing that the body will do is to utilize stored fat via lipolysis. Lipolysis has to do with breaking down of triacylglycerate, which is stored in adipose tissues. into free fatty acid and glycerol. The glycerol broken down will then undergo gluconeogenesis to glucose 6-phosphate. This glucose 6-phosphate will be converted to glucose to produce glucose. This glucose is utilized by brain and other tissues. After that, the other pathway of lipolysis, when this fat is broken down into free fatty acid and glycerol, the fatty acid pathway will undergo conversion from fatty acid to ketone bodies. These ketone bodies are utilized by the brain. Utilization of ketone bodies by the brain supply energy in form of acetoacetate, beta-hydroxybutyrate, and acetone. When one depends on ketone bodies for survival, at that stage, the person might be smelling acetone, which is known as acetone breath. And when ketone bodies are utilized for a long period of time, it will result to coma and eventually death. When the body finishes utilizing ketone bodies, then the body will switch on to utilization of proteins. Proteins that are stored in the muscle and other tissues will be broken down to amino acid. This amino acid will then be converted to pyruvate. Then pyruvate will be converted to glucose 6-phosphate. Glucose 6-phosphate will then be converted to glucose to generate energy for the body. Then after the metabolic response, the next stage is the survival state. This metabolic response initiated by the body initiated those responses in order for the body to survive. The duration of this survival depends on the amount of stored macromolecules, such as triacylglycerol, proteins, and so on. When the amount of stored fat and proteins are high, then the length of survival is going to be high. But when those stored macromolecules are stored in lower quantity, then the survival length will be low. That's why people that are fat or overweight tend to survive starvation longer than people that are lean. After the survival stage, the next stage is the death stage. The death stage is a state at which the body has already utilized all the alternative source of energy. When the body has finished exhausting those other sources, the next thing that will start occurring is exhaustion of the reserve nutrient, circulatory failure due to brown atrophy of the heart, recurrent infection, dehydration, and hypothermia, electrolyte imbalance, and etc., are those things that will result or that may lead to death. In conclusion, starving the body of adequate exogenous food supply is very detrimental to health, as it deprives the body of basic nutrients, which in turn affect metabolic activity, weakens the immune system, causes emaciation, affects cognitive reasoning, impaired development of child's body, cachexia, and death of cells, organ malfunctioning/death, system failure, and ultimately death of the organism. People should invite on taking care of their body by giving the body the right nutrients in order to avoid all these problems that are listed in the conclusion. Thank you for listening. Here are my references.